4 elite climbers vanished into a vertical ocean of limestone at -20 degrees. One was left dangling just 5 meters from rescue, his hands deteriorating into frozen stone as a single knot sealed his fate. Why did they leave themselves no exit from the murder wall? You are standing on the terrace of the Kleine Scheidegg Hotel, squinting through a brass telescope at the limestone wall that the locals call the Ogre. It is July 18th, 1936, and the air smells of expensive cigars and alpine wildflowers, a cruel contrast to the vertical hell 2 kilometers above. Through the lens, you see 4 tiny specks: Kurz, Hinterstoisser, Angerer, and Rainer, clinging to a mountain that has already claimed 3 lives in as many years. They are chasing a gold medal promised by a regime that views them as expendable icons of stone and ice. The ambition was simple: conquer the last great problem of the Alps and return as heroes for the Berlin Olympics. They carried 80 pounds of gear each, including heavy hemp ropes that would soon become their own frozen shackles. By the second day, the temperature plummeted to -20 degrees, and the mountain began to scream with falling rock. One stone, no larger than a fist, struck Willy Angerer's head, leaving dark stains across his wool cap. This was the first critical failure. They chose to push upward instead of retreating. Look at the Hinterstoisser Traverse, a slab of smooth rock that required a suicidal pendulum swing to cross. To save time, Andreas Hinterstoisser pulled the rope through the carabiners once they were across, effectively deleting their only path home. They were now 1,000 meters above the valley floor with no way back. It was a tactical blunder born of arrogance, a decision that ignored the shifting clouds and the falling barometer. They had found their way in, but the Ogre was already closing the door behind them, sealing the exit. By the time the storm hit on July 20th, the 4 men were trapped on a ledge no wider than a bookshelf. The rescuers in the railway tunnel could hear their screams through the rock, yet they were separated by only a few meters of impassable ice. Why did these elite climbers, masters of their craft, abandon the most basic rule of survival and leave themselves no lifeline? The official report cites the weather, but as you stare through that telescope, you realize the physics of the hemp rope tells a far more harrowing story. What was the final, silent betrayal that left Toni Kurz dangling alone in the white? They stepped off the ledge of the world and into the vertical sea of limestone, leaving behind the safety of the valley floor for a promise of glory. The weight of 80 pounds of gear pulled at their shoulders, but the adrenaline made them feel weightless. Kurz and Hinterstoisser led the charge, 400 meters of sheer rock vanishing beneath their boots as they climbed with a speed that felt like a challenge to the gods themselves. It was 1936, and for a few hours, they were kings of the Eiger. They moved with a fluidity that mocked the murder wall, unaware that every foot gained was a foot further into a cage of their own making. The German and Austrian teams merged into a single chain of 4, a tactical move that felt like strength but was actually a fatal slowing of their pace. Look at the shadows lengthening across the North Face in this rare morning photograph. Then came the moment that changed everything: the Hinterstoisser Traverse. Andreas moved like a shadow across a featureless slab of ice-glazed rock, finding holds where none should exist. He reached the other side and secured the rope, creating a bridge for the others to follow. It was a masterpiece of technical skill, a feat that should have ensured their names lived forever in the journals of the brave. Observe the narrow ledge where they stood, barely wide enough for a human foot. But then the arrogance of the youth took hold, and they made the most ghastly mistake in alpine history. They pulled the traverse rope through the carabiners, taking their bridge with them to save weight for the summit push. They had burned the only path home, convinced they would only ever be moving upward toward the sun. In their minds, they were invincible. In reality, they were now prisoners of the altitude. Look at this heavy hemp rope, stiffening as the moisture begins to freeze. The barometer began to tremble, falling toward a disaster they refused to acknowledge. The wind started to whistle through the limestone cracks, a low moan that sounded like a warning they were too energized to hear. They were now 600 meters up, and the first flakes of snow began to drift past their faces. The white shroud was starting to wrap around them. Notice the heavy gray clouds swallowing the summit in this archival weather log. By sunset, the triumph had begun to sour, and the adrenaline was being replaced by the first cold bites of cortisol. They had reached the first ice field, but the ice was harder than they anticipated, and the shadows were turning a deep, bruised purple. They were kings of a kingdom that didn't want them, standing on the edge of a choice that would seal their fate forever. Examine the handwriting in Kurtz's diary, still firm and confident, unaware of the silence that was coming. The mountain has a way of letting you feel like a giant before it crushes you. By the morning of July 19th, the four climbers were no longer dancing. They were grinding. The temperature had plummeted to -20, turning their sweat into a layer of jagged ice against their skin. The wind began to scream through the limestone cracks, a high-pitched wail that never stops. Look at the frayed edges of this hemp rope, already showing the first signs of structural fatigue. Then, the mountain threw its first punch. A shower of falling rock, loosened by the freezing air, swept down the face like vertical shrapnel. A stone the size of a man's fist struck Willie Angerer squarely on the head. He didn't fall, but the crimson began to seep through his wool cap, steaming in the thin, cold air. The Austrian was now a liability, his movements becoming slow and robotic. Examine the dark stains on this reconstructed wool mountaineering cap from the 1930s. This was the moment for a tactical retreat, the last exit before the trap snapped shut. But the hollow hunger for glory kept their eyes fixed upward, ignoring the obvious signs of a gathering storm. They were obsessed with the summit, oblivious to the fact that their pace had dropped by half. They were losing the race against the barometer, and the Eiger knew it. The mountain was just waiting for the dark. Look at the heavy, dark clouds swallowing the Eiger's peak in this archival photograph. By late afternoon, the clouds weren't just gray. They were a bruised, sickly purple. The extreme deprivation was setting in, their rations of bacon and dried fruit freezing into inedible stones. They finally realized the summit was an impossible dream and turned to descend. But the Eiger doesn't let go that easily. The descent was a nightmare of shivering limbs and clouded judgment. Look at the shaky, erratic lines in this weather log, recorded by the observers at the railway station. They reached the top of the Hinterstoisser Traverse and felt the first true wave of terror. The smooth rock they had crossed so easily days before was now a vertical skating rink, glazed in a thick, translucent sheet of ice. Without the rope they had so arrogantly removed, the way back was a wall of glass. They were trapped on a ledge, 600 meters above a valley they could see but never reach. Observe the featureless, icy slab of the traverse as it appeared during the storm. The viscous flow of the storm turned the North Face into a waterfall of snow and ice. They began to huddle together, four men trying to share a single breath of warmth as the light vanished. The lost were already being claimed by the mountain, even if their hearts were still beating for a few more hours. They were standing on the threshold of the end, and the silence was getting louder. Look at the silhouette of these four figures, huddled on a narrow ledge as the blizzard consumes the frame. The law of man ends where the vertical ice begins, and on the night of July 21st, the law was repealed. The four men were no longer climbers. They were prey, huddled on a ledge while the Eiger began its final harvest. A massive avalanche, a wall of white noise and weight, thundered down the face with the force of a locomotive. It was an unstoppable erasure. Look at this forensic diagram showing the sheer volume of snow that funnels down the Eiger's North Face couloirs. Hinterstoisser, the man who had conquered the Traverse, was the first to be abandoned to the gravity of the wall. The slide swept him into the abyss, a 1,000-meter fall into the dark that likely ended before he could even scream. Then came the rope. The weight of the falling Austrians, Angerer and Rainer, snapped the tension, leaving one man strangled and another fated against the rock. Look at the jagged, frayed ends of this 1936 hemp rope recovered from the site. Toni Kurz was the only one left, a solitary speck of life dangling from a single strand of ice-caked hemp. He spent the night standing on a ledge no wider than a brick, his legs shaking with extreme deprivation, while the storm tried to shake him loose. He was alone in a way most humans can't comprehend, surrounded by the remains of his friends, suspended over a void that wanted him next. Look at this long-distance photograph of the lone figure of Toni Kurz dangling from the wall. By morning, the sun mocked him with a brief appearance, revealing the rescuers at the tunnel window just 5 meters below. 5 meters. The distance between life and a museum exhibit. But Kurtz's hands were no longer hands. They were frozen clubs of flesh and bone, his fingers deteriorating in the biting wind. He had to use his teeth to untie the frozen knots, a task that took 5 agonizing hours of struggle. Look at these rusted, heavy iron pitons that were the only anchors holding him to the world. The plan was a desperate gamble. He would unravel his rope, lower the strands, and pull up a fresh line from the rescuers. But the rope they sent up was too short. He had to tie it to his own, creating a knot that would become his executioner. As he lowered himself down, he felt the knot slide through his frozen hands until it hit the carabiner and stopped. He was inches from safety, yet miles from survival. Look at the mechanical bottleneck of a 1936 carabiner jammed with a thick rope knot. He struggled for another hour, his strength fading as the viscous flow of the wind pulled the heat from his core. The rescuers watched, helpless, as the man who had survived the impossible finally reached his limit. He looked down at them, whispered 3 final words, and the silence took him. His body slumped in the harness, a frozen figure left to swing in the alpine wind for all the world to see. Look at the final entry in the rescuer's log, where the ink begins to smear from the damp. The snow eventually stops, but it never really forgets. After the storm of 1936, the Eiger North Face was no longer just a mountain. It was a vertical graveyard. The frozen figures of the lost remained suspended for months, swinging in the alpine wind. A grim reminder of what happens when nationalistic pride ignores the barometer. The Swiss authorities briefly banned climbing the face, a desperate attempt to legislate against human hubris. Look at this vintage Swiss newspaper clipping declaring the North Face off-limits to climbers. The forensic verdict, paragraph 21, isn't found in a courtroom, but in the evolution of the gear. We realized that organic hemp was a death sentence once it absorbed moisture and froze into a steel rod. Modern synthetic ropes were born from the deteriorating remains of Toni Kurz's final struggle. We replaced the heavy forged iron with lightweight alloys, but the hollow hunger that drove those 4 men remains exactly the same. Look at the side-by-side comparison of a 1930s hemp rope and a modern dynamic climbing line. They were only 5 meters from the gallery window when the end came. That tiny distance became the legacy of the disaster, a measurement of the thin line between a hero and a statistic. The dark stains on the rock were eventually washed away by the spring melt, but the story of the Hinterstoisser Traverse became the definitive textbook on tactical blunders. The mountain didn't cheat. It simply enforced its own gravity. Look at the modern memorial plaque located near the Eiger railway station window. Cynics say they died for a medal that would have been forgotten by the next decade. Maybe they're right. But as a forensic investigator, I see something else in the faded journals. A raw, terrifying honesty. They chose to burn their bridges because they couldn't imagine a world where they didn't win. It's a recurring theme in the history of human exploration. Every vanished expedition leaves behind a trail of ignored warnings and broken tools. Look at the final shaky signature of Andreas Hinterstoisser in the hotel guestbook. Today, the Eiger is climbed in a matter of hours by men and women with satellite phones and waterproof shells. They fly past the spots where Kurz felt his life fading as if they were nothing more than scenery. But the remains of the 1936 party still haunt the limestone. The mountain is still there, waiting for the next person to pull the rope and leave themselves with no exit. The silence of the ogre is patient, and it is absolute. Look at the vast shadowed expanse of the North Face as seen from the valley today. The final toll wasn't just 4 lives. It was the loss of innocence for an entire generation of mountaineers. We learned that nature doesn't care about your medals or your politics. It only cares about the knot in your rope and the warmth in your blood. The forensic record is closed, the artifacts are behind glass, and the wind still howls through the gallery windows. The lost have been found, but the mountain keeps the change. Look at the rusted carabiner found at the site of the final bivouac decades later.